Hello, I'm Peter Deegan, the lead tutor for the RSSL Auditing Career Pathway. Welcome to the next podcast in our series, My Auditing Journey. These interviews are aimed at talking with auditors from across industry to gain from their knowledge and experience in auditing. This is an important part of any auditor's continuing professional development activities, to learn from others. Today I'll be interviewing Marc Helouin, who has worked both in classic GXP audit roles but also including corporate governance audit, which I'd like to explore later. You will tell by his accent that Marc, whilst he's lived and worked in Europe, is a United States citizen and has returned to the USA recently. So I'll be keen to explore his experience on both sides of the pond, as they say, as well as his role as a global auditor. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for taking the time.
Marc, it'd be great to hear from your personal academic and career background for those listening in.
Sure. So academics, graduate of the University of Colorado with an undergraduate degree in chemistry. Picked up Juris Doctor in the U.S. That's our professional law degree. Picked that up after about 10 years of work experience. I've also got experience at the University of Cincinnati studying drug development. So academically, those are my formative experiences. As far as professionally, I've been working now post-university for, good heavens, nearly 30 years. So I had a chance to see a lot and do quite a bit. As far as my auditing journey, let's see, if I do the sums correctly, I ended up getting my first auditing qualification in 2007, which was actually a year after I'd finished my law degree and had passed the bar. I'd gone to law school thinking at one point I was going to do intellectual property law until such time as I determined that was no fun. So when I figured out that I was really happiest in QA, and I'd done QA work for probably the prior 7 to 8 years, but always sort of as an associate, not necessarily as a leader. It became clear to me that if I thought I was going to carry my QA and my auditing career, it was worth really getting a level of qualification and training in what auditing looked like. So my first auditing qualification was through the American Society of Quality as a certified quality auditor. I think I got that in 2007, 2008. That was a good entree into understanding what auditing looked like. When I joined AstraZeneca in 2011, I went through the PQMS lead auditor training course. And that was, again, another really good experience that was probably a bit more focused and a bit deeper in pharmaceutical quality manufacturing.
I want to explore your training in auditing and your certified IRCA lead auditor. How did that course make you a better auditor?
A lot of auditors that I observe tend to base their approach on auditing based on their professional experience. I think the IRCA framework and the IRCA taxonomy provide a bit more of a philosophical background around what auditing can and can't do and what's effective and what isn't. So if I take a look at, I'll call it an IRCA certified auditor versus someone who has maybe worked in QA for 10 years and has done some audits and has picked some stuff up along the way, there's a bit more of a structure in the auditor's thinking if they've been through an IRCA course. And I think that structure helps you both analyze the situations you're looking at as an auditor, as well as candidly gives you a bit more confidence as you're having maybe some of those tougher discussions about what you've discovered during the audit and what remediation may need to look like.
That's really interesting feedback, because that's what we try to say on our RSSL courses and the audit career pathway that we are now using within the RSSL framework. You have to start somewhere. The first question I always asked was, what was your first audit and what did you learn? Did you do your first audit before the IRCA course or after?
So before, I suppose the question is, in what In what capacity? So certainly when I was at Boehringer Ingelheim, well before I'd had the IRCA training, I had been both backroom and front room supporting a number of GMP audits, but never in a lead role. So that's probably my first experience in that sort of an audit situation. I then got a chance to do some internal audits in my role as, at that time, a quality section head. And it was good, but it was casual from the perspective. It was just sort of another task that I was doing without a lot of background and a lot of training. As I had gone through then the IRCA training course and had a chance then to ultimately lead audits with, again, a bit more training, bit more perspective, bit more confidence, it was interesting to reflect on sort of the very tactical nature I'd taken on the audits I'd done pre-training to what I hope was a bit more strategic and candidly a bit more helpful approach after I'd been trained through the IRCA taxonomy.
We ran the lead auditor course last week, and the auditors delegates, they certainly go through a journey, sort of Monday, Tuesday, day one and day two. We give them some initial audits to conduct, and they're using their gut feel and their, as you said before, their professional experience. And I wouldn't say they're all over the place, but as you say, there's a non-structured approach, gut feel, using my instinct really, rather than by day 3, day 4, when they're doing the really detailed audits. As the learning programs, a bit more structured, a bit more confident. And we had some feedback a few audit courses before where the individual says, it's now given me the confidence as this course to walk into the audit room and sit down and say, hello, I'm the auditor today. And I guess you can probably feel that.
It does make a difference. An effective auditor has got to be able to attack the audit with a level of credibility and a level of capability to provide some confidence to the folks he's going to be auditing. So it does make a difference.
I'm very interested to explore your background as a lawyer and your thought processes and how you look at the world from an auditing construct. In the pharmaceutical industry, we use the word compliance, ISO use conformance. In the UK and EU, we use UDRELEX Volume 4 as the regulatory GMP guidance. Only if there are serious issues would such as MHRA or EMA then invoke the law in a court of law to litigate you. Whereas my personal experiences in the USA, where 21 CFR 210 are binding in law automatically. So in IRCA and the ISO terminology, this is what we call audit criteria, which are the written words against which we audit. So as an auditor, from your experience from worldwide background, and also as well having set audit programs for inspection readiness across the Americas, how important are setting the right audit criteria, and how flexible can you be as an auditor in the interpretation and the responses you get from auditees when they are potentially binding in law or just guidance?
How important are the audit criteria? Whether it's audit criteria or whether it's the elements of a particular law you've got to be compliant with, you've got to know what you're targeting. In the United States, as you point out rightly, Department of Health and Human Services promulgates through 21 CFR 210 and 211 the broad legal framework of what, as a manufacturer, you've got to comply with. But underneath that, you've got FDA as part of the Department of Health and Human Services effectively interpreting what that codified language means. So you've got some very high level language in the CFR. You've got to, for example, have effective and enough resources to do the work. Well, what does that really mean? That's part of the interpretive challenge that quality management function needs to evaluate, what an auditor needs to judge. And whether you're doing a legal analysis or whether you're doing an auditor evaluation, the core question that you're usually trying to answer is, well, hey, why is this okay? You're on the back foot when you're operating in this industry. Everything you're doing is under scrutiny. So at the end of the day, you've got to be able to answer the question, well, why is this okay? What I have found, and this is true both in Europe and in the US, regulators, they take their role seriously, but they're also, generally speaking, quite competent. And you can have that sort of data-based, science-based discussion. Here's the rule that we're trying to target. Here's the criteria that we are aiming for, and this is why we think we're okay. You won't always win those discussions, but you're in a much better position if you've got a documented, detailed position you can share with a regulator or an auditor in order to demonstrate why what you're doing makes sense. Again, I think I'm at the risk of rambling just a bit. Does that make sense?
Oh, very much so. It was interesting. We ran an internal auditor course in-house a few weeks ago, and we put a lot of emphasis. We follow the ISO auditing guidance as the framework, which chooses audit criteria, which are in Europe, it's the Udrelex Volume 4 GMP guidances. And, I was advising as an auditor, like you just said, it's important to know the framework. So if you see a documentation non-conformance, you know that that's chapter 4. If it's a training or personnel, you know that's chapter 2, because then you can go to the guidances pretty quick to be able to understand your reference points. And one of the delegates said, hang on a minute, I thought we just had to audit against our SOPs. Why are you constantly talking about the GMP corporate framework or the legal framework?
Yeah, it's important because in a perfect world, your SOPs will reflect your legal requirements. Having said that, not all SOPs are created equal. So it's really important to understand that if you're targeting activities, that you're targeting the right expectations. I will take 30 seconds to make a pitch for what I think is a good GMP framework, and that's the PICS piece. My personal experience and what I think I understand about PICS is there's been a lot of work by a lot of people over a lot of years to come up with what is, broadly speaking, a harmonized, effectively well-recognized global approach to GMPs. So if you're getting fussed around, oh geez, is it CFR, is it Udrelex? I like PICS. And I say that as a guy who has used it to set up QMS in a couple different shops that have walked through a number of audits in pretty good nick.
I like that because I like the ICH quality models as well, and particularly at the IRCA course, we work through ICH Q10 a lot because that's the background where management responsibility for quality came up from the ISO 9001 series, and we recognised that particularly in GMP it was all about product quality, patient safety, and ICH Q10 now builds into that management responsibility, continuous improvement, achieve a state of control, facilitate knowledge management. So it is that common global language. As global auditors, it's really hard to go in to say and interrogate what's the local national quality management system, quality framework. PICS goes a level above that and gives you a standard for GMP. We were talking last week about World Health Organization GMP guidances. We cover a global framework of GMPs for auditor instruction. And what I like about the World Health Organization GMPs is it's absolutely fit for purpose for the environments in which it's purporting those GMPs to be embedded. It talks a lot about water systems. It talks a lot about HVAC systems in their GMPs. Why? Because the environments in which those countries are very challenging climatically. So it's fit for purpose and it gives you that common language.
Yeah. Again, you're not doing anybody any favors as an auditor coming in and using the wrong standards. So really, the best auditors are able to really do the assessment ahead of time. What are my standards? If you're doing a WHO GMP assessment against, candidly I'll say a Pfizer facility in the United States, there's probably not a lot of value in that activity. But if you're, by the same token, if you're taking a Udrelex approach to a pharma company in a less advanced part of the world, you're not doing them a service in a slightly different direction. So it really does have to be horses for courses, right?
Oh, very much so. And at RSSL, we have two lead auditor courses. One is the classic GMP lead auditor. The other one is what we call pharmaceutical supply chain, which is the framework is ISO 9001, but we also use the pharmaceutical quality group PS 9000, packaging standards, EXIPACT, ISO 15378, etc. Primary packaging, because when you go to audit a supplier who does not work to GMP, as a GMP company or as a pharmaceutical company, we go in with our GMP hat on and we audit them to UDRELX, or we audit them to 21 CFR Part 210, 211. And we say it's non-conformance, and they say, but we don't work to GMP, we don't need. We make the widget, we make the excipient, we make the printed materials. We have our own standards, but they're not your standards. And you can't just go in with that belligerent GMP hat on and expect them to comply.
And I don't see regulators, certainly the best regulators I've seen, are very clear on where a product or a component is in the value chain and what the right standard is. I'm not doing aseptic handling standards as against a plastic component manufacturer. It's just nonsensical. Again, you've got to rely on the regulators to be good partners, and they see things that you don't. They actually have a unique position to see across companies that are registering their products with the various applications that they make. They get a broad data set that really gives them a view as to where risks are. So, take your relationships with your regulators seriously. You'll learn something.
So let's explore that. So you've got experience in global supply chain auditing. One of the areas we explore in great detail during our training courses is the role of the auditee, and many auditees come on to our training courses to be trained in auditing so that they can see the other side, so they can compare more structure. What does good look like in an auditee? How do they approach the auditor, both in terms of process, both in terms of relationships? What's your experience of that?
So the best auditees, in my view, have probably been auditors because they probably know what I'm expecting. So if I'm coming into a company to do an audit, if I've done my job correctly, I will have done some planning. I will have provided them with an audit agenda and a list of easy to decipher deliverables. I'd like to see their site master file. I'm going to want to see a list of SOPs. With respect to their QMS, I'm going to want to see examples of deviations and change controls and corrective actions, all the things that I think I would expect to be asked for if I'm leading the quality unit of a manufacturing facility, and I had to demonstrate to either a regulator or to a customer auditor that, hey, this is why this is okay. There's a level of organization, a level of candidly savvy and experience. You can't necessarily wait for me to ask for everything. If you want to show me that you know what you're doing, have that SOP index pre-printed and ready for me when I walk in. Have the org charts ready. Have the site master file ready. If you're really on your game, have a couple expert packs ready. And by an expert pack, I'm talking a 3-page PowerPoint slide deck. This is our SOP and documentation system. We run it in this particular EQMS. We review our SOPs every 3 years. This is our expert pack on deviations. It's run on this SOP. Over the last year, we've done 100 deviations. 3 of them were critical, 50 of them were major, the rest were minor. Nothing hard necessarily, just things to show that you've got a system. Your system is providing you data that you can use to evaluate your performance, and you're able to present it in a very concise, organized manner. It lets you, as the auditee, actually help drive the conversation. You're the one putting out that initial bolus of information rather than me as the auditor coming in with, good heavens, whatever it is I'm thinking about this particular system. Now you've given me something to evaluate. That's going to drive where my questions go.
I like that a lot. And what percentage of auditees are in that proactive phase versus the reactive phase?
If you have a good level of GMP compliance and you've been through this rodeo before, that's candidly what I typically see it at, sort of GMP finished product manufacturing facilities. When you start going further up the supply chain to excipients or packaging component suppliers or APIs, less so, because the standards maybe aren't as well articulated in those particular contexts.
It's very interesting you say that about the packaging suppliers, excipient suppliers, because again, we've got global standards. The whole supply chain in the food and pharmaceutical component industries are getting better and better, and understanding and standards are becoming more tangible, more understandable, more realistic, more achievable. But I'm quite interested that you still feel that there's less of an understanding about why we're auditing. A lot of these companies could well be ISO 9001 certified, which still requires audits to happen. Why is there a difference still, Mark?
If I'm 100% honest, especially for companies where compliance maybe isn't quite as front and center as pharmaceutical, it becomes an issue of risk. And I suppose that's probably true with most things. We audit ultimately to at least understand and ideally mitigate and control our risk. In the GMP context, there's a bit more enforcement horsepower behind it because of UDRLEX or CFR behind us. But yeah, if you're a packaging component supplier and maybe 10% of your business might have been an opportunistic contract opportunity with maybe a contract pharmaceutical manufacturer, maybe you got lucky and had a good contract with a top tier pharmaceutical manufacturer, that's still 10% of your business. 90% of your business is maybe in the less regulated space. And while I can wax poetic all day about the value of being an ISO 9001 registered facility with the systems, with the infrastructure, continually driving lower and lower defect and reject rates, that's a cost of doing business that has to be fit in with all the rest of the costs of doing business. So there's the ideal, and then there's probably the reality that you've got to recognize.
I think that mitigates the response from certain excipient manufacturers. I'll caricature this, but it's not far from the truth. Look, you buy 50 bags a month from me, I sell 7 tons a week to a different industry.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, look, as the marketing authorization holder, you're on the hook for justifying everything going into your product and everything going into your application. But the practical aspects of that mean that, as complicated as today's pharmaceutical products are, nothing's going to be 100%. There is a risk-based evaluation that needs to be made around what is and isn't acceptable. And again, I have to say in the same breath that regulators, I think, understand that.
Oh, I agree. And I think, interestingly, as we move more away from the traditional small molecule chemical synthesis molecule, a tablet capsule, we are getting more and more complicated formulations, and therefore more and more complicated excipients, shall we say, where they're a much more complicated technical supply chain. So we still need to mitigate those different changing risks.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And actually, that brings up a really good point. Auditors don't do any of this stuff in a vacuum. So there's the audit piece of your supply chain, but your auditors absolutely need to be working with what I'll call the quality management side of supplier management to understand how those partners are performing and where those risks are. So yeah, the audit without question has use, but it's part of a broader piece of managing that vendor's performance.
It's so interesting how many junior auditors come on the training courses, and we talk a lot about setting the audit program, which is the one or more audits over a specific time frame towards a specific purpose. And we talk about the role of the audit program lead and the audit client. And actually, the quality auditor, that GXP auditor, is just one part of that overall vendor assurance chain, and that we push them a lot in the mock audits that we do. Are you going to make a quality decision, and can we start the order? And the auditor really has said, no, I'm assessing quality. I will hand back to my audit client, who's doing the overall vendor assurance, vendor management. And we also as well talk about our due diligence prior to an audit. If you're doing a complicated supply chain, have you interviewed your procurement department? Have you read the contracts? Have you read the quality agreements? You can't just turn up at site and look at the factory. It's the overall process of vendor assurance that's critical to that overall audit outcome.
Yeah, and it's actually so as a guy right now who doesn't do audit as part of my day to day. I'm currently head of quality for a small biotech, so I'm a bit more interested, if I'm honest, on a day to day basis about really understanding the capabilities and the quality of my vendors. So the audit piece is important, but I'm putting together a supply chain right now for the manufacture of a very complex biologic. The bill of materials is hundreds of line items long with, good heavens, 2, maybe 3 dozen suppliers at this point. And a number of those suppliers are top tier suppliers in the biologics manufacturing space. So one of the questions you've got to ask yourself is, okay, do I think I need to audit company X? Well, company X may not even let me in, but based on what I know about them, are they ISO 9001 registered? Do they have the evidence to demonstrate that they've got the quality management system in such that I can conditionally approve them and make a risk-based decision that, yeah, I'm going to use them, even if I can't get in and audit them? So again, the audit piece, always useful, perhaps not always possible. You've got to work with your quality supplier management team to really understand what's necessary to be able to comfortably use the materials that you're going to have to if you want to make the product.
Is there a difference between auditing in a biological product supply chain versus a traditional small molecule synthetic supply chain?
Well, sort of the quick and easy and probably wrong answer is, nah, not really. Auditing is auditing. Probably the more nuanced answer is, in biologics manufacturing, there are a lot more, even if you don't have a sterile process, you're going to have a number of steps in the process that are sterile or aseptic. Those sort of critical, contamination risk steps, because at the end of the day, if you contaminate the product, you don't have a product. I guess my oversimplified view is higher levels of performance demand a higher level of diligence by the auditor. Does that make sense?
Very much so. And so my corollary question to that, is that the same for internal audits as well as supply chain audits, that extra diligence and understanding of the process?
Again, I think it's probably a horses for courses answer. My internal audits, even in the best of cases, and I'd like to think I've done this for a little while and that I have a nominal level of competence, but for my own internal audits, I'm not objective. I in this particular company I work for right now, I built the quality system, so I'm not entirely sure how objective my internal auditing is going to be. There's a value, and in fact, in the case of our company, we actually bring in an external auditor once per year to give us hopefully a more objective verification of health of our quality system. For purposes of doing the external supply chain auditing, I feel a bit more objective, and I can perhaps be a little less emotionally invested in the quality system I'm auditing if it's not mine.
So let me explore this word called independence. And the ISO guidance, it's got the 7 principles of auditing, one of which is independence. And it's a very nicely worded set of paragraphs, because it says auditors should be independent where practicable. And there's a specific paragraph that says for small organizations, this may not be truly capable, but as long as you're free from bias or conflict of interest, then do your best. You've worked in corporate audit, and I worked in corporate audit quite a few years ago when we were revising our corporate model, and I learned a lot that for a public listed company you have the board and you have executive and non-executive directors, and for an audit team to be truly independent, they can't work for the company. And therefore they report to one of the non-executives who's head of the audit committee on the basis of classically agency theory, where I'm an employee of the company, so I can't be truly independent. Even the CEO is not truly independent. So how far does independence go at the very top corporate level from your experience? What's the value proposition of having a truly independent corporate audit group versus going right down to the factory floor and you've got an internal audit team who's works it every day and are auditing their friends and colleagues?
What I have seen at typically larger multinational global companies is what my old boss used to refer to as the 3 lines of defense model. Well, what does that mean? So if you're looking at a 3 lines of defense model, the first line of defense to protect the company's interest and assure compliance, that first line of defense is factory floor oversight. The independence, there's not going to be any, and that's okay. You've got now on top of that first level, a second level, sort of the corporate specialist audit functions, people who come in from home office to a plant and are, I think, demonstrably and practically independent by any sort of meaningful, practical use of the word. Those folks are coming in, they're not tied to the plant. They may not know the people at the plant. Yeah, they all work for the same larger entity, but there's a level of independence there, and I think that's credible, and I don't think anyone really opposes that view. And then you've got your third level, which, at least at my former company, was sort of the group internal audit function. And that group internal audit function oversaw the work done by the second line specialty corporate audit functions. The second line specialty audit functions took a look at what happened at the first level. So there's a constantly escalating level of oversight. And then to sort of put the cherry on the top, these large multinationals, the group internal audit function that I worked for was also looked at by the external sort of Ernst & Young's, Deloitte's, McKinsey's of the world, who clearly different entities, truly independent. So why do I like that model? That model, I think, is probably the best mix I've seen of leveraging the people who work in the plant every day, taking advantage of what they see, balancing it against a level of independent lines of defense that maybe see what they don't see. And at the end of the day, you've got an external group looking at how the business is managing the various lines of defense and making a judgment call. Is this effective enough?
I like that last sentence. Is this effective enough? This is the risk-based approach to your processes and your products to ensure that you have adequate independent view. Because we are largely a human workforce, we haven't achieved automation like some industries have, where we're error-free. And also as well, it's the interpretation of those humans, professionally qualified, experienced, trained, who have a way that they feel is the best way to work. And as an independent auditor, you're also assessing that decision to go one way or the other as well.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of humility that the auditor probably needs to keep in mind, that if you're coming in truly independent, you've not seen either this process or this company or this supply chain before. You may have a view as to what good looks like, but you may not have the full context such that you can draw enough of the right conclusions. So a bit of humility a bit of coming into the audit as a learning experience, I think, is good counsel.
So what truly does inspection readiness mean from an auditing context?
Well, I mean, if you said, Mark, what is your inspection readiness program at your plant? We actually have a standing weekly meeting to go over what we think sort of the key deliverables are for the fundamentals of a successful inspection. Where are we at with SOP updates? Has the site master file been updated? Where are we at with printing out for a particular client key documents like batch records, like investigations, like certificates of analyses? Where are we at on being up to date on vendor risk assessments and vendor audits? So for us, it's probably more of a focus on deliverables within our particular inspection readiness context. I'd like to say it was slightly more complicated and nuanced than a checklist, but it's probably fairly checklist based, because having been through this a number of times and having done the audits a couple of times, I know what I look for. Again, it's really, as an auditee, how can I get out on the front foot with an auditor by being ready and demonstrating to this character that I know what I'm doing and they should be confident in what I'm doing.
I really like that. I liked your previous comment about your expert packs as an auditee, to be able to show the auditor, because we're going to be asking the same types of quality system questions, and it shows you're ready, and it also allows you to articulate how you've interpreted it as an organization and how you enact it, because every company, every process will be different, and the challenge as an auditor is going in without that bias. You don't do it like I do it, therefore that's a non-conformance, rather than how do you do this. Inspection readiness is really ICHQ 10 1.5.2, is it? Establish or maintain a state of control. And it's almost like your expert pack to be able to show an auditor what we have defined as a state of control and what metrics, measurements, processes we have in place to achieve that. And in some ways, that's perfect, because that's owned by the business, not by the auditor.
100%. And I think, in a perfect world, the auditor asks a question, you give the auditor an answer, it's good enough, and you move on. That's perhaps not the world in which most of us operate. There's invariably a level of discussion. And again, I come back to the term humility. The best auditors I've seen really take the time to listen and get under the hood of a particular system to understand, could this be adequate? It may not be my way, but is this good enough? Could be. Tell me more. I think as long as the auditor is coming to those sorts of discussions with a spirit of good faith, rather than, oh, I'm going to get into trouble with my boss if I don't come up with a level of observations. I think if you have the good faith discussion, you'll end up in the right place.
No, I think that's really cool. I really like that. Again, it's doing your risk-based approach to start with, putting your quality system to mitigate that risk, using your experience and know-how, and at the end of the day, understanding who the true customer is, and that's our patient. Put that front in your mindset, and at least you've got a good direction, and then as an auditee you can articulate that passion, that direction as regards patient quality. The processes should then be able to describe how you intend to achieve that, and the auditor's role is to establish whether conformance and evidence is there to verify it.
Absolutely. And sort of the really interesting auditor-auditee discussions oftentimes don't necessarily revolve around compliance as to whether or not you are or not compliant. But is your approach sustainable? Are you missing anything? It's easy to get emotionally invested in your quality management system if you think you're doing the right thing. But an auditor is always an external set of eyes. You're going to learn something. I have yet to see the quality system that captures it all. So, if you're doing your job as an auditor, you're bringing value to your auditee. By the same token, as an auditee, if your auditor is coming to you in good faith, listen to that auditor. There's probably something there to help you improve.
I think that's a very wise comment there. listen on both sides. That's why you've got two ears and one mouth. Listen more than speak, I think, is the adage that we use.
Yeah.
I want to explore your international experiences now, Mark. You grew up in the USA and you established an auditing program for the Americas, as you called it, both in North America and also as well South America, but the Americas nonetheless. You were then head of quality in France, and so you've worked in a leadership role of quality in Europe as well. Many of our newly qualified IRCA lead auditors, which we train in our SSL, then go on to do global audits. So what's your experiences of auditees or audit processes across the world? I've got to fly out to a particular country or a particular region I'm British English. I've got my cultural background and I've worked internationally in my experiences, but what advice can you give on auditing in a different country or a different region that you may not have a lot of experience on?
If you are working globally, you are working cross-culturally, there is a level of onus on you as the outsider to learn a bit about good cultural behavior from an auditor. So what do I mean by that? As an ugly American, I know what the view is of Americans across most of the world, and that is what it is. But if I'm going into China, or if I'm going into the UAE, or I'm going into South America, it's probably worth me, beyond understanding the technical things I need to know about my audit, probably need to learn a little bit about cultural behaviors. And again, probably reflecting on being an American, trying not to come in as the ugly American. It's probably where being a listener and giving a bit of grace and a bit of good faith to the auditees in different cultures really makes a difference. Broadly speaking, people want to show off and do well. They want to show you they know what they're doing. But it is not easy working in not your first language. Ask me how I know. So when you're auditing, usually in English, with people who may not speak English as a first language, it's on you as the auditor. You're the lead auditor. This is your show. Give people an opportunity without compromising the integrity of the audit. Give people the opportunity to show you what they're able to do. Give them some grace. Don't be afraid to let them clarify. Give them time to be able to do their job and understand this isn't a standard 2-day audit that you would do for a supplier in Raritan, New Jersey. You need a little bit more time for people to do their job, and that's fine. Just plan for it. Does that make sense?
Oh, personally as well, I went to school in the UK. We had a different, what we call a middle school system. So I started learning French 3 years before classic secondary school. I started learning French from the age of 9, and then I had pen pals, and then I went to France and I worked in France. My sister has lived in France for 40 years. So I wouldn't call myself fluent in French anymore, but I can get by very well. And when I went freelance, I was asked to do an audit in Montpellier in France. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do this in France. I've worked for an Anglo-Swedish company for so many years, and all my Swedish colleagues say, you should try working in a second language every day and see how tired you are at the end of the day. So I did it. I was exhausted. And the other thing I learned is grammatical structures and interpretation and intent of language is when somebody responds to you in a second language, when I'm auditing in a second language. In my native tongue, I go from A to B. In my second language, I have to go to A to C, to D, to F, to Q, to R, back to B, because I'm not fluent enough. And you can get nuances of interpretation, you can get misinterpretations. And that's where I liked what you said, give somebody a bit of space to really just listen to them, listen to the keywords. Even if that's in your native tongue, listen to the keywords, to try and listen to understand what are they trying to tell me. It doesn't really need a different language to listen in that regard.
Yeah. I think the other thing I would say, what I found for 3 years, sort of not working every day in my native tongue, when I was speaking French, there wasn't necessarily a lot of room for nuance. So you ask me a question, I'll give you what the answer is. And I think there needs to be sort of an understanding that the nuance that you and I can bring to a conversation, because English is ostensibly our first language, it may not always be there with folks who are operating with English as a second language. And to be candid, with a couple exceptions in France, just because of the context, every international audit I've had, bar two, have been in English. And as an English speaker and as a guy who speaks English as a first language, I'm in a bit of a power position in those transactions. You got to be aware of that. You've got to be sensitive to both the authority and consequences of what a bad audit could turn out to be for that organization. So yeah, I go back to what I said a few moments ago. Give people space, give people grace, and understand it's not going to be a standard 2-day affair. You've got to build in the time to let the communication and understanding happen.
Oh, absolutely. That's part of the audit planning and risk assessment about the achieving success of the audit is understanding the environment that you're going to audit in, not just assuming that processes, procedures, language will be, like your analogy, like home.
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
So, Mark, you just mentioned that you're not auditing anymore. You've had auditing in your role and in your career. What has a competence in auditing, training in auditing done for your career?
So I guess when I look at what I think a QA professional ought to have in their background from a skills perspective, auditing is foundational. And I may have mentioned earlier in the discussion that a big part of what auditors do, I think, is ask the question, well, why is this okay? Well, that's a really useful skill, especially if you're head of quality for a plant. And if I'm thinking for a moment, at least in my last company, I don't know any heads of quality for any of the plants in that organization that didn't have a real capability around doing audits. They'd either done it in a previous career, they had done it as part of doing work in other roles within that plant, but auditing and that capability of using data to drive judgments on adequacy is really critical for being, in my view, an effective site quality head. So, yeah, in no uncertain terms, I would say that whether you're an auditor as a career path or whether you're an auditor for a couple stops on your career path, it's foundational to career success in the QA space. And if I use myself as an example, I've actually gone back and forth a couple of times doing sort of senior individual auditing, then leading an audit group, then going off and doing something different, and then coming back to auditing and doing it at the corporate level. So there are a lot of paths that the auditing capability supports from a career development perspective, and that's maybe one of the key messages I'd give to folks who are thinking about auditing as either a career step or a career path. It's a great foundational skill that opens up a lot of doors.
I think there are two very clear builds to that. One is absolutely you see the world differently from an auditing perspective as a quality professional. And the question I always say very early on in our training courses is it just QA that could do audits? And absolutely no. Anybody in the organization can do audits because it is a step back, turning back the mirror towards our customer quality, which is the patient. The other benefit, as I see, is, and I like what you say, that you sort of step in and out, head of quality, back into audit role, leading teams, is to be that audit champion at all levels. when somebody says at the business level, well, why do we need this? What's the value proposition of audits? It's just a lot of money to travel and resources. Then somebody can be that advocate and put it into context as to the value proposition. That's really important to me because it's often done poorly. It's often done not at all. And you just go back to ICHQ 10 and achieve a state of control, facilitate continual improvement, management responsibility for quality, and the ISO guidance on auditing talks about the individual responsible for managing the audit program and the audit client. Both have to be knowledgeable in auditing and its understanding of A, its process, and B, its value to the business. I think that's a fundamental requirement to be that audit champion.
Yeah, it's a good shout out because, again, I'm answering this question from my perspective, so I'm probably thinking QA more than anything else. But yeah, I know a number of auditors who've been IRCA certified who come to it from a supply chain perspective or a production perspective. I love that. I think it makes them better professionals in their domains by virtue of getting that training. So yeah, it's not a QA specific role for sure.
Marc, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear your auditing journey story today. And we hope that for those of you listening in, some nuggets of wisdom. My final question then, Marc, is if you could go back to your former self when you first started in this great industry that we work in, and your boss said to you, Marc, I need you to do an audit next week. I know this is the first time you've ever done it. What letter would you send back, and what are the 3 nuggets of wisdom you'd give to yourself before you first start that audit?
Understand what my boss is looking for. Understand the risk profile that this supplier has on this particular either supply chain or operation, and understand the relationship between my company and this company. Try and really understand the background because all of those things end up feeding the risk assessment of what's going on. Yeah, those are the 3 things I think I do.
Absolute nuggets of wisdom. Marc, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure catching up with you after all these years, and I wish you great success as the head of quality in your new ventures.
Thank you, my man. I appreciate the opportunity, and nothing but success to you and yours.